hello, and thank you all for having us. Let me just start by calling up the rest of the panel. Professor Kusum Das, who's a professor of economics at Ramjas College, Delhi. Professor Selim Raihan, who's a professor at the University of Dhaka and the founder of the South Asia Network of Economic Modeling. And Dr. Ganesh Wignaraja, who's the chair of the Global Economy Program at Lakshman Kadirgamar Institute of International Relations and Strategic Studies. All right, so I had this initiative called Pakistan at 100, where we're thinking about Pakistan's future over the course of more than a year. We're looking at a holistic picture of the future, and the idea is that when you start thinking of the future, you can get out of your current constraints and start thinking more generally about what lies in the future and what is the way for us to chart sort of a more optimistic path to progress and prosperity. And so we thought one sort of interesting expansion of that would be to think of South Asia. South Asia is a region, it is an ideological construct, it's a set of neighbors that are both working together and sometimes in conflict. And to think of where this region will go in the next 30 years is of importance not only to this region, but also to the world as a whole, given both the size of the region and its current growth overall. And so what I'd like to do today is ask all of my panel to reflect on different aspects of the relationships within the countries, and then maybe talk also a little bit about their countries specifically and other countries in the region. And so this is certainly not sort of supposed to be an exhaustive discussion in the sense that, first of all, we're missing 3 other countries. There's 7 countries in South Asia. But also just in terms of the coverage, obviously you can't cover everything. So this is just a set of reflections, and that's how I'd like you to think of this. I'd also like to encourage all of you to think about, reflect on what you'd like to know and what you already think about South Asia going forward. And over the course of the next few days at SESM, we'll be coming to you to potentially record or at least absorb the lessons and reflections that you've had from this. So with that, let me start with Professor Das. You initiated the idea of the South Asian Economic Students Meet, and you've run it through 15 consecutive years, and there's been both great success and also challenges that we've faced. Can you reflect on both that journey for SESM, but also maybe speak a bit to the broader South Asia, how SESM reflects on South Asia in general? And I'm going to ask my panel to start using mics, please. There are 2 that you'll have to share.
Thanks, Ali. As I sit here to begin the 15th celebration of SESM, my thoughts are back in, I don't recall, maybe 2002. I was attending the South Asian Econometric Society meeting at Lahore. And it was very difficult to commute from Delhi to Lahore. There was no I'm talking about 2002. There was no direct flights to Lahore. One had to go to Dubai and take a flight. My journey wasn't easy because it was a winter morning in Delhi and I missed the Emirates flight and missed an Air India flight, and the PIA left before I could even reach Dubai. Anyway, the idea of starting this kind of a annual initiative for students of South Asia actually began in the corridors of LUMS, where a host of Pakistani students who were volunteers to that conference said, we want to visit India. When I came back with that kind of idea back to my college in Ramjas, it was very difficult to think of visit India, visa and stuff like that. Those were important those days also. And probably in individual capacities, people have relatives in India, people visits for weddings and stuff like that. One wasn't very sure if students visiting on a scale was a thing. So what happened was that a bunch of very excited young students at Ramjas decided to launch a conference. let's get to know South Asia better if we have to invite Pakistani students, and that's how it made a beginning in Delhi in February 2004. It was a wonderful visit for the first time. They came by train, and we met them at the station. There was a lot of media hype at that time. The newspapers said that the Pakistani students visiting Delhi, and it turned out to be a very, very encouraging effort, and that's how we are continuing throughout this thing. But increasingly, we are realizing that what started off on a very happy platform, maybe to some extent is not a very happy platform, because of our bilateral tensions between each other, and also because things are difficult. And when I say things are difficult, just for a minute to organize a conference like that, just think there are no direct air connectivity between South Asian cities. I remember a long time back in Kathmandu, Pakistan team had to travel via Dubai to come to Kathmandu. So these are very, very important things. But yes, an initiative which is very important, that at least we get to know each other, we share a common history, South Asia, and it's important that our young students or young youth keep meeting on a regular basis, despite what's happening at the political level. It's been a very encouraging journey. If you see Facebook posts, we have over 1,000 alumni. They keep talking to each other on birthdays and different things. I remember myself when I first visited Oxford University, my host was a Pakistani student at Oxford. I went and stayed with him. It was such a heartening sight to see somebody waiting for me at Oxford railway station, "Kis sir aaye hain," from India. So this is very important, Ali, but then we are facing a lot of difficulties. What remains of South Asia today, and we are meeting here for a South Asia Economic Students Meet, is that Kathmandu and Colombo probably remain welcome to all of us. And beyond that, everybody has issues, and everybody has suspects, everybody sort of doesn't trust each other, or to a certain extent. So it's tough, but we have progressed to a large extent. But I would say that the main challenge today is to keep moving ahead, despite wherever we are, at whichever situation we are. Because if this little connect between the youth of our region disappears, then I think South Asia has a lot to think about, rather than eradicating poverty, inequality, and other economics things. So I'll start off with that.
So actually, before I let you go, can you sort of share some experiences of student interactions where they arrive and they're behaving a certain way, and by the time they're going?
Yeah, I would remember that the first few days of this competition are competitive, because everybody is fighting for country honors, the papers, the discussions, everything. But once the competition ends, once you know who's won and who's lost, it's friendship all along. And to this end, this conference is very unique that we have planned a retreat along with it. Retreats are usually something you hear when political leaders go and meet each other. But we thought that it's very important, outside the confines of learning, that we also share our tastes, our likes, our dislikes, and things like that. And our retreats are very, very useful thing. Last year in Bangladesh, we realized that the organizers had made a seating arrangement for students. The students would not buy that. They would think that we will go along with that wherever we want to sit next to each other, creating a lot of chaos amongst the organizers, and it happens wherever we do, but this kind of thing. But at the end of the day, I think those 2 or 3 days, they really get to know each of them. They come with a lot of perception about each other, that, oh, so-and-so is like that, so-and-so is like that, but it's been a great unifier in the retreat.
And actually, I said I'd let you go after that, but one more question is, what sort of entities have supported this journey, and where do you think more could be done to support initiatives like this?
I think we started off by looking at our own countries, the funding agencies within our own country. The first few SESMs were notably funded by internal sources. I remember when we went to Pakistan in 2005, Babar Ali Foundation was the main thing. Similarly, in India, we have very many initiatives. Right now, the Indian team is sitting in Colombo thanks to Nandan Nilekani of Infosys. He's been funding us for the last 3 years to support the Indian team in this kind of thing. But the World Bank has come to us in a big way, along with our internal sponsors. And what is even more interesting about this SESM is that every country has pitched in to provide resources to come here. We no longer believe that the host has to take the entire burden. We also pool in with our resources and try and help the host by helping him out with our thing. The World Bank has been a big funding source for us, along with others, local sponsors.
All right, so I wanted to start off with SESM, not just because we are here by its grace, but because it's a microcosm of the larger possibility and challenges that sort of these collaborative initiatives within the region face. Ultimately, a region is defined by these sort of bodies that create a cooperative framework. But let me now go to Professor Raihan, who has done a lot of work on trade in South Asia, and just ask you to please give us a broad strokes picture of where trade stands in the region.
Thank you, Ali. I think it's a great opportunity to have this session, and I must thank the SESM organizers to invite me. I will just take where Professor Kusum does. He ended. We started something with high aspiration, but then over the last 15 years, things have changed quite a lot. There are positives, there are negatives. But as Ali asked me to talk more about the broader perspective, the South Asian region and the region integration issues, I would say that we all know, probably the students who are preparing the paper and presenting the papers, that this is one of the least integrated regions in the world. If you use the interregional trade ratio, it's around 5%. So there could be many reasons. There have been many efforts to increase this interregional trade, but success has been very minimal. Why is that? We can ask, we can explore, probably we can jump into the very easy answer that probably India-Pakistan bilateral relationship, or now growing Bangladesh-Pakistan bilateral relationship, and then other issues, probably more of the political issues which are affecting this interregional trade. But probably we have to actually get into more deeper aspect of it. In my view, I think there are some structural problems. One is, of course, if we look at the sizes of the countries in this region, probably we would not find comparable region in other part of the world where you have a big country like India occupying more than 70% of region's GDP, region's population, or probably the land mass. I think then it comes the kind of huge imbalance in the sizes. So that is one of the structural factors. And then the kind of the land border India has with most of the countries, and the other countries except Afghanistan probably has only, Afghanistan has land border with Pakistan, but all other countries have land border with India only. So I think these are the structural factors which are given. So your neighbor is given, so you can't change your neighbor. So probably that is something one deeper understanding we must have. Probably we get very agitated that I don't like my neighbor, I don't like this and that country. But this is something you can't change. But what you can do, what we can do, we can improve the relationship between the neighbors. So that is something in our hand. So these structural factors, I think some of it is given, and some of it we have some control over it. But other thing, I think the more fundamental issue is that these countries, we start to blame each other. That look, I don't get market access, I can't export to your country, because you have a lot of non-tariff issues, you have tariff issues, you have many other trade facilitation issues. So we just love to blame each other that, I can't get my export product to your market. But do we look at ourselves? Are we following with the countries, individual countries, following the right kind of development policies, or right kind of trade policy, right kind of FDI policy, and of course the human capital development policy. So if we compare this region, South Asia, with region like East Asia or Southeast Asia, we will see it's not simply the trade policy which mattered, as Ali is asking, how we can increase the trade. It's not only the trade policy, it's not only simply about opening up. What is your FDI policy? What is your human capital formation policy? What is your health and education expenditure? How do you, are you able to have better command over your macroeconomic management? So I think these are the very fundamental things we must look at ourselves. So where I may try to argue that the kind of development convergence what we observed in Southeast Asia or greater in East Asia, that led to their integration in a much broader way. That kind of convergence we don't see in terms of development policy in South Asia. Some of the countries probably they are doing a bit of better way, but most of the countries we are actually going into very, very different direction. So if we really want to increase the international trade, I think we have to get our domestic policies right, and then I think we can actually get into the regional trade issues more effectively.
So I do want to take the conversation to individual domestic problems later on, but sticking with the idea of South Asia as a region, South Asia is a sort of, it's an idea. You can think of it as India's neighbors. You can think of it as a World Bank defined or an international entity defined set of countries. Dr. Wignaraja, let me come to you and ask what you think of South Asia as a construct. Does it make sense, and what alternatives might we have?
So this is a wonderful opportunity for the young to tell the old people like ourselves how to think of South Asia in a different way. And as you heard from Selim, that geographical construct of India with all its neighbors around it was one concept that people talked about since the 60s or probably a little bit earlier. And we've kind of been stuck in that because of the Indo-Pak problem, because of foreign officers dominating this debate and the security establishment rather than the economists and others. And the result is this very low level of interregional trade and very little investment. India hasn't really managed to become the motor that would connect the different bits of South Asia in the way that, say, China has acted like that motor in the context of East Asia, right? So the South Asian story is there. It's an aspiration. It's a dream. We share a lot of common history and culture, but per se economically hasn't done what we would like it to do in terms of a motor of driving change, right? So we need to think of a couple of alternative constructs. One construct is really taking this South Asia, or indeed the individual countries in South Asia, and connecting them with East Asia. And India has been trying to do this with the Look East policy, which some of you may have heard of, and now it's called an Act East policy. Since about 2014 with Prime Minister Modi, the Look East started in basically 1991-92. And essentially, it's India's way of going to East Asia through trade integration, lowering tariffs, trying to attract foreign investment. And it has been somewhat successful in doing this. In terms of trade agreements, India has trade agreements with ASEAN, Singapore, Japan, and Korea. The extent of India's trade with East Asia has increased significantly. India-China trade is up, and so on and so forth. India is becoming increasingly a destination for outward foreign investment from China, which is a very interesting story when you come to something called global value chains, which is geographically distributed production. Now, the question there is not so much for India, but for the rest of South Asia. Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Maldives, and Nepal. Can these countries join up in some way to the big engine that you see in East Asia? Okay? And so we need to think of South Asia, East Asia integration as a new construct at the national level, but also the idea that if India goes to East Asia, it carries the neighbors along with it. And we've got something called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is this big trade agreement that many countries are negotiating, 16 countries in East Asia, the Pacific, and others, and India is a key part of that. Down the line, can the others in South Asia be part of that storyline? And can we then have also infrastructure that follows the trade? So that's one construct. There is a second construct, which I hope the young ones in this audience will be brainier than the rest of us, in taking South Asia and linking it with Africa, okay, and with the Middle East. And so we have something which comes through cooperation through the sea, the ocean. And we have this wonderful Indian Ocean around us. And the Indian Ocean is that region which in a way is increasingly becoming an ungoverned space. Okay? What do I mean by that? There's increasing maritime piracy. We have a drugs problem that people talk about a lot. There is increasingly also tensions between maritime powers. And on the upside, it's the region that could really be a motor for the world economy in one sense. You have India in the center of it, but you have all the maritime users as well. So Indian Ocean Economic Cooperation, in a much, much looser sense than the kind of rigid institution-based cooperation that you have in South Asia through the SAARC process, is another way to go. And the specialization is with Africa, the vast continent, with natural resources and abundance of land, with the manufacturing capacity we have in South Asia and the people. And so there are some exciting new frameworks for you all to look at, which takes you beyond the narrow confines of South Asia as a political construct and the depressing story of limited interregional trade, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we have some interesting things to think about, and it's up to you all to kind of do the analytics to kind of come up with the interesting storylines.
Okay, so one major sort of force that will act on the idea of South Asia is China's Belt and Road Initiative. And I know you've done a report where you reflect on that as one of the major trends that will impact South Asia going forward. Can you, just starting with you, but this is a question for all of you, can you reflect perhaps on how the BRI is going to play a positive or negative role, both a negative role potentially because of perceived antagonism between India and China, but a positive role in terms of the Lotus Tower behind us, Chinese investments in each country?
So I take a slightly unconventional view of the BRI. South Asia is very capital scarce for its infrastructure. Okay, there is across Asia some $1.something trillion infrastructure deficit. Okay, in finance that's needed. Who can fill this, right? China has very deep pockets and is a source of infrastructure finance. Okay, and it can in Sri Lanka, and we are a test case for this. It's building a port. It's building a port city, which I hope you all get a chance to see. It built an airport. It's building many highways. It can provide that kind of finance. Okay, so and it does it in a kind of a turnkey manner, right? So you go to China, you say you want something, you get it, and you get it ahead of schedule, and it's built by Chinese. Okay, now therein lies the dilemma. Okay, what are the linkages that the local economy can get from this? Will Sri Lankan workers be employed in these types of projects? Will small and medium enterprise from this country get a chance to be subcontractors to some of the large-scale firms that we might expect from China and East Asia? Can indeed Sri Lanka service the debt that we're taking on because these loans have variable interest rates, often at market-determined rates and so on? The short answer, though, is we're not in debt-trap diplomacy in Sri Lanka. China has 10% of our debt today. So Mike Pence's thesis isn't right, but down the line it could be a problem. So I think providing we do our homework in a country like Sri Lanka, and indeed in some of the others, China can be a powerful engine of growth along with others, the World Bank, India, many others, Japan. And it's really up to the recipient country to use this powerful engine which is available for countries. So my take is slightly different to the normal narrative.
Have you, though, sort of seen any displacement effect where the fact that investment has come in a big way by China makes it less urgent to seek investment by, for example, India and the World Bank in this country?
So in Sri Lanka, investment to GDP ratio is insufficient for the kind of growth rate we want. We have 4% or thereabouts growth. To deal with the inequality problem that we have, which is a growing issue, I think our Gini is something like 39.5% compared to 30-odd% some time ago, so it's rising. We need growth rates of something like at least 6% to 7% plus, right? So we have this big deficit. I think we'll need this from all kinds of sources, and the real question is, can we pay for it, right? In the Sri Lankan case, the problem is not so much the debt to GDP ratio, which is around 78%, or the debt servicing, which is around 16% today, but the fact that half this debt, service and so on, is in foreign currency. Okay? And 1/3 of it is maturing in the next few years. So we have a kind of a bunching problem, right? And we are very exuberant in our public expenditure. And I think that's a very nice thing to give people: free health, free education, free subsidies of all kinds. But the question is, can we afford it? So China, in that sense, I think, can be a really important source, providing we do our homework properly.
Selim, let me come to you. China invests greatly in Bangladesh also. But let me start with the same question, which is, how do you see Chinese investment in Bangladesh vis-a-vis sort of the Indian role in your economy? And then we'll open up a bit about the Bangladesh growth story more generally, but I'll come to that later. Let's start with the Chinese investment.
I would say that, I start by saying China is a reality. So China is the leading or most, the largest trading partner for most of the South Asian countries. So it's a reality. And probably India is the second largest trading partner. So now, when it comes to BRI, so China has its own plan, definitely. So it has been probably, what we read from different newspapers or articles, the kind of plan, it's a very ambitious plan to expand these economic corridors through different 6 economic corridors. That's what we heard here. But as far as the importance of Chinese investment and BRI is concerned for Bangladesh, I think one fundamental thing has to be worked out, and I take it from Dr. Wignaraja, that your homework, it's not only simply also homework, but also probably if you can make these BRI projects apolitical. The problem with BRI was that initially and until now, it has become kind of a political agenda. So when it comes to Chinese investment, when it comes to Chinese presence in one of the South Asian countries, because of the bilateral relationship between India and China, political relation, we can see the kind of sensitive issues being raised. But interestingly, China is also India's one of the largest trading partners. And as Dr. Wignaraja has mentioned, the largest Chinese investments is being actually destined to India. So if India can make this thing kind of apolitical, can go beyond the political relationship between India and China, then why not the other South Asian countries do that? So I think this is something we need to look at this issue very carefully. Second thing, I would say that as I was talking about the homework, it is also the role of the political elites in these countries, how they handle this issue. Because I will just quote our political leader, or the Prime Minister, the way she was mentioning, referring to this BRI project just day before yesterday in one Indian newspaper. She was giving an interview, and she was asked to respond to one specific question, because China has offered Bangladesh to build an expressway from Chittagong to Kunming via Myanmar. So then the Indian newspaper asked her would it make India unhappy? Or would it make India kind of very sensitive to this, or kind of objection? But the answer she made, she said that we need both China and India, because China has money and also India is our closest neighbor. So we also need connectivity. So I think if you can handle these 2 elephants, I know it's very difficult to handle elephants, but you need to have achieve this maturity as well, the political leaders. Otherwise, I was actually attending one of the workshops on BRI in Kathmandu in November, and one of the speakers was mentioning quite a bit sarcastically that any of these countries who was relatively aligned to China, there was a change in the government. I'm not naming any of these countries, but you can actually understand. So that means it's very sensitive. So I think that is the overall. The projects, the opportunities are there, huge opportunities. Dr. Wignaraja, he has researched on it. I myself have some research on BRI, and we have found that there are huge potentials for countries if we can actually get these things on the right direction and get our homeworks rightly. But on top of that, I think one fundamental problem all these South Asian countries are facing I would not take India in this list, that we have serious problem of domestic capacity in implementing these infrastructural projects. Timely we can't implement, cost escalation, and huge inefficiency, and then of course the rent-seeking activities. How do you handle these things? So I think we need to develop our capacity to implement these projects, big infrastructural projects. I think that can also help us quite a lot in minimizing the risk and maximizing the benefit of BRI.
Let me share with you my impressions. And so for the audience, these are just the reflections of 4 people. We don't represent the country. There's a diversity of opinions in every country, and we're only speaking to our individual views. But my view of CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, is sort of that it's been Pakistan's engagement with this has been very strange, in the sense that when President Xi Jinping visited Pakistan and the big announcement came of CPEC in 2014, I believe, the phrase that was then bandied about immediately, reflexively, was that CPEC is a game changer. And then everyone and their aunt started talking about a game changer. So CPEC is the game changer, without sort of articulating what the nuts and bolts are of the engagement, whether we need that factory or whether we need that power plant or not, whether that road can wait another 10 years. That level of specificity I found to be missing from our conversation. The other thing from the Pakistan experience, and I don't know, I have to profess ignorance, and this is a great opportunity to hear from Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, is that we lacked sort of, as Selim said, the domestic capacity to reflect on what CPEC meant, but it also sort of in some sense seems to insulate us. So there's a confidence that comes in where you can almost think of CPEC as a rival to the idea of South Asia. We've got this sort of connectivity to one of the biggest economic powers in the world. They're working with us, and thus perhaps trade with India isn't as necessary anymore. So there's a recent World Bank report that says that we're leaving about $44 billion in trade on the table by not connecting South Asia. But if CPEC becomes of similar scale, then it becomes less of a problem for Pakistan. The other thing is that when you look at Brexit, you think of Brexit. I was in Oxford when the Brexit referendum happened, and all of England was ignited by this, by the passion of thinking either pro-Europe or anti-Europe. Estimates say that Brexit will perhaps have 2% impact on the UK's GDP. CPEC is expected to impact Pakistan's economy by about 20%. And yet there's been no sort of engagement in our country on whether there's no referendum, there was no conversation on this. And so for me, those are some of the constraints. Clearly, CPEC is a huge opportunity for our country, but I find lots of gaps in how we as a country are engaging with that. And perhaps the two of you could reflect on your countries and how they've engaged with the Chinese investment, and then I'll come back to Dr. Das.
So I think we were a sort of an accidental recipient of Chinese investment, if I can say so. I mean, there were particular political circumstances, and the government of the day got involved with China very closely, and investment flowed, and particularly the Hambantota port, the Matale airport, these were byproducts of that period. So China is very much here, and remember, this is a small economy, 22 million people, per capita income $4,000 something, thereabouts approaching. And so China has a disproportionate impact here. I think going forward, my institute, the Lakshman Kadirgamar Institute for International Relations, is doing a study of how we make Chinese investments more productive in the future. And we're doing this with Chatham House going forward. And one of the things that we're coming up with is we have to really have a national strategy for infrastructure, first of all, whereby we identify what are the gaps, and we try to do some very good homework on what are the important projects we need to have. Then you look at the development finance bit, and who's going to give you what on what terms. Yeah? That's the first bit you've got to do, right? The second thing is this point that we have been talking about, is you've got to try to build up the capacity in your infrastructure ministries plus your external resource department to be able to manage those types of projects. Yeah? And then at the third level, you've got to do, the bits about the bads, right? So we've talked a bit about rent seeking, we've talked a bit about political interference, we've talked a bit about, enclaves being formed through Chinese investment, and so on and so forth. We've got to deal with those bads, because those bads ain't going to go away. If anything, they're going to get much, much worse. Yeah? So we've got to perform this judo trick of, doing the throw of the person over our shoulder to get the infrastructure boost for our economies, while making sure we don't fall flat on the mat on the next move with all these bads that might come. Yeah? And that's a really tough ask. So we need a serious national conversation in this country, and indeed all the rest of the countries, about how do you handle this motor which can help you today, but can leave you with a lot of undesirable things going down the track. And I think that is the really big issue going forward.
Yeah, I'll just add what Dr. Wignaraja mentioned. Probably one fundamental question comes to my mind when it comes to these big infrastructural projects. China is the big elephant, but we don't really want China to spend on something on white elephant, which creates white elephant. Some projects or some infrastructure, and then which we can't use properly. It's just a wastage of money. So here comes a fundamental question in countries like us, including my own country, that the policymakers, what they're interested in. Probably they're more interested in getting these big infrastructural projects, where, of course, it has implications, it has growth implications. I must admit that these are necessity, definitely. But unless and until you have a proper designing of those projects, or you can't feed those projects and make them consistent with the need of the economy, then the problem is that what I call, you may end up with an entitlement failure in infrastructure. That means you develop big infrastructure, you increase the supply of infrastructure, but the sectors or people who want to use them, they can't access them because there are many barriers, or there are many small problems which you ignored. For example, you can build a big expressway, but you don't build the connecting ways, small connecting ways through which you can link other parts of the country, then the big expressway probably will remain empty. So here I see that a biggest challenge for countries like my own country, Bangladesh, and of course other South Asian countries too, that there are promises of big Chinese investment in big infrastructural projects. So along with the challenge of domestic capacity to implement them, I think it is also more of a political economy issue, how you prioritize those projects, and whether you understand the policymakers and the academia, they have a better understanding of the priorities of the economy, so that they can link those infrastructure projects with the necessities.
All right, Professor Das, let me come back to you now. So I just framed CPEC or the One Belt, One Road or BRI as, in some sense, a rival model to South Asia. And the key here is how India perceives its neighbors, whether as a threat or as an opportunity. It is already sort of involved in supporting infrastructure, in building relationships in the region to try to sort of address the Chinese involvement in the region. So first of all, what is your impression of how your country is looking at South Asia, and do you see a path whereby it begins to challenge the Chinese intervention in the area by sort of through the route of the concept of South Asia?
My own personal take here would be that relative to what we heard, like Sri Lanka or Bangladesh, we do exceed that China as a leading player, the world's biggest factory, as far as the entire world is concerned. But probably on a development priority for India to move ahead, to be on its own growth momentum, China within the domestic frontiers may not be as important. Why I say this? Because for India, there are major issues within the domestic frontier. We're in an election year. we've had a remarkable growth run post the global financial crisis of that 2003 to 2008, which has unfortunately slowed down. We weren't impacted to the extent China was impacted, because we are still not the world's export market that China is. But we do realize that if India has to improve its position within South Asia, India has to put its house in order on many fronts. One of the major challenges today in a country which is reaping demographic dividend is providing jobs. And unfortunately, we have not been able to be a manufacturing factory as China is, or even Vietnam or Laos or other countries are. We do realize that. To a large extent, growth has been pumped by services sector, but then services have their own limitations. They can provide skilled employment and not the kind of employment that we think we need, the large workforce given the population and stuff like that. Also, very important for India is that we have a huge informal sector. Things like labor reforms keep cropping in from time to time, and it engages academia in a debate whether India has done enough to reform its labor market or not, whether that's still a stumbling block to manufacturing and things like that. But we do realize that we cannot rely on services on one hand for a long-term stand. We need to get back to manufacturing. But the question then remains, how do we get back to manufacturing? I mean, the world's, where do we stand on that manufacturing ladder? There are efforts which are being made now to recoup the manufacturing sector. Policies are being put in place like Make in India, Skill India, National Manufacturing Policy before the current regime came into power, but results are still at a very low level. We have to wait for years to see where. Also, what we are realizing, given the size of the economy, our agricultural sector is probably important. There was the initial 90s era where we went gaga over economic reforms. Our tariffs were brought down, our non-tariff barriers, we claimed to the world we are an open economy. You could probably no longer wait at the airport and see people coming from Europe and bringing a huge Sony TV. Or if you have somebody gifting you a Levi's jeans, we do that. But still, question remains, where is the job going to come from? Somehow or the other, the agricultural sector needs to be reinvented back. A country which has had green revolution, white revolution, sometime to a certain extent needs to rethink, and there are efforts being made. It's probably the agricultural sector's development at a much faster pace than what we have done will also provide some answers to being India. How effective can India be in global value chain and stuff like that. So my take is that, yes, we realize China is a big player. We need to engage with China. But we also need to set up our house in order to be more effective engagement with China. That would be my take.
All right, so that leads us naturally to this. You can bifurcate South Asia into high growth and low growth countries, or in relative terms. Bangladesh and India have had sort of very relatively high growth rates in the last couple of decades. Sri Lanka sort of bounced back after the end of the war, but not quite at the same levels of growth. And Pakistan sort of teeters at lower levels. And so the question to the two of you would be, what do you think are the big lessons that we can learn, the rest of South Asia can learn from how these countries have got their house in order in terms of growth?
Actually, yes, Bangladesh over the last 2 decades, if you look at the growth rate, it is kind of ever increasing. Actually, decade by decade, we added 1 percentage point growth rate to GDP. So in 1980s, it was 4%, now it's 90s, 5, then 2006, now 7. So this is remarkable, no doubt. And then, as Professor Das was mentioning, in the areas of social fronts also, some of the women empowerment, women labor force participation, as well as in terms of getting enrollment in education, women enrollment in education, girls enrollment. I think Bangladesh has turned out to be a kind of success story. I would want to pitch another area where Bangladesh has also become a success is the ready-made garments. Because Bangladesh is now the second largest garments exporter in the world. And while we are discussing about countries' experience in South Asia, Bangladesh probably turns out to be relatively closer to Southeast Asia compared to other South Asian countries when it comes to manufacturing value-added share in GDP. Bangladesh has been able to increase this manufacturing value-added share in GDP, though it is driven definitely mostly by ready-made garments, but despite that, we have a very high concentrated export basket, but despite that, it's a success. But now probably one fundamental question would be, how Bangladesh could achieve it. If we look at different indicators, like, if you look at World Bank's doing business indicator, Bangladesh is probably behind Afghanistan. If it's 176th position in 190. If you look at different logistic performance index, Bangladesh is probably lagging behind many other countries in South Asia. So I would say that one fundamental area where Bangladesh's political elites were successful is that they created some efficient pockets. Though the whole economy probably would see that there are some inefficiencies in terms of high cost of doing business or, in terms of lack of infrastructure. But when it comes to 2 or 3 areas, I would say 3 areas, or probably I would extend to 4. One is the ready-made garments, of course. There were some very efficient pockets were created for the exporters, so they could export it kind of without much barrier. So they did not really face the challenges where the rest of the economy were facing. In terms of remittance, Bangladesh was pursuing the policy of labor export, and then remittance were coming back in the country, and then somehow it was used in some investment on productive sectors, or even it boosted the consumption. Third is the agricultural growth. The economy is also, I would say that it was learning from the one famine Bangladesh experienced in 1974 after the War of Independence. And that really, shook the policymakers that we can't afford a famine like this. So what then happened in all the governments, successive governments, despite their political differences, they had the very strong, what I call political settlement, borrowing the term from Mushtaq Khan, or you can say it's a political agreement that we can have political differences, but whoever in the power, they would really give focus on agriculture, how to increase the productivity, food security, and of course, ready-made garments and remittance. And the fourth one, I think Bangladesh has also become a very success story on the microcredit, the NGOs. So that was also being facilitated by the government or the state, in the sense that the state did not intervene in that area. The state did not create any obstacle to the microcredit expansion. So I think the experience or the learnings from Bangladesh, which I would really try to convey to the other South Asian countries, that if we look at the overall picture, the economy or the society can turn out to be incompetitive or some inefficient, but if the political elites can agree to create some efficient pockets, things can be very, very beneficial.
What is that doing to your inequality?
Inequality, interestingly, what happened, though in 70s and 80s, if we compare, that recent time inequality is growing up. Definitely that's a big concern now for the economy and for the society as well. But it has not yet crossed the danger mark. But again, I would agree that that's still a big, growing concern, that the growing inequality in the society, especially though we are having high growth, but there are issues of probably the quality of growth in terms of what Professor Das has mentioned, the job creation, apart from ready-made garments. These are I think, what I call the next generation challenges what the economy is facing now, and the economy has to sort out these challenges for the next phase.
So countries with Chinese investment face this because of the special economic zones model that's being, I think Dr. Wignaraja, you alluded to this earlier. Do you have thoughts on this?
Yes, I have an interesting comment on Salim's point. So Bangladesh indeed has been growing at 7% or so in the recent period, and part of the story is what you said, and I just wonder on the garment story. I have some interesting numbers here. So the average hourly wage for a Bangladesh worker is about 27 US cents, okay? The Sri Lankan equivalent is $1.07, okay? So Bangladesh at some level, and for Pakistan, Mr. Chairman, you'd be interested, 62 cents, okay? So Bangladesh, in terms of international subcontracting in garments, is the cheapest location, right? Now, productivity in Sri Lanka is higher than in Pakistan or Bangladesh, okay? Output per worker measured in that industry. So in that sense, it's not surprising in some sense the garment industry is moved. Those of you who are political economists will read a conspiracy theory into this, because it's the women in the garment factories who are paid poorly and are exploited through the surplus exploitation story. Yeah? So at one level, it's the race to the bottom. Right? The challenge for Bangladesh, I would have suggested, Selim, is can you upgrade your wages and your productivity to go into that medium tech end, right? First in garments, and then eventually to switch into the allied areas. Now, Sri Lanka has got stuck in the textile dominance of the economy, right? But what has come up here is the bit that we didn't anticipate, is the rise of services. Services are increasingly, so we've gone from low value-added manufacturing and textiles, where we've had a consolidation with about 40 companies in the sector that have become vertically integrated and very high productivity, doing the Marks and Spencers and the high-end fashion. From there to services, we haven't got toys, we haven't got electronics, we haven't got, there are big holes in our industrial structure, right? But we've jumped into services. So the challenge, I thought, for Bangladesh would be, can you follow the East Asian kind of newly industrialized country by upgrading, within the garment sector, and then eventually switching into the allied areas? Domestic market, being the size it is, may give you that advantage. So that was just a question.
No, I fully agree with Dr. Wignaraja. Actually, when we make the comparison between countries, so probably the first question comes, which country are comparing with? So Bangladesh has definitely done well, compared to many other South Asian countries. When it comes to comparing with our competitors in Southeast Asia, things are not really very promising. There lies much bigger challenges. I give you one data. In 1985, 4 countries have had almost similar per capita GDP. Bangladesh, China, Vietnam, and India, all less than $300. And in fact, Vietnam had lower per capita GDP than Bangladesh. China, India was relatively just 1.3 times per capita GDP than Bangladesh. And by 2017, China's per capita GDP has been more than 8 times. Vietnam's per capita GDP is almost twice. And the distance between Bangladesh and India did not grow. So it was remaining almost the same. But on the more important point, what Dr. Wignaraja was mentioning, during that time in 85, I looked at the data, both Bangladesh and Vietnam had export volume just a little bit of more than $1 billion. By 2017, Bangladesh has export of $38 billion. And you can guess Vietnam how much it has now? More than $200 billion. In 1985, both Bangladesh and Vietnam had almost similar FDI GDP ratio, or the amount of FDI. Very low. But now Vietnam's FDI is around probably $20 billion, and Bangladesh is stuck at $2 to $3 billion. So what I'm saying, the point I would really like to mention that, there are much bigger challenges, or there are very much better performer in Southeast Asia. And when you make the comparison, I can say that Bangladesh has a much bigger or larger challenges ahead to complete.
Okay. Now I want to move to sort of a more optimistic pitch, and I want to see whether you find this realistic. And that is, it's optimistic, but it starts from a problem. So from Lahore to Delhi to Dhaka, Kathmandu, we have the big problem of smog these days, air pollution. And more generally, we share ecologies and an environment. So you can talk about groundwater, where Indian farmers being subsidized on pumping water from the ground reduces the water table across the border in Pakistan, for example, and so on. Do you think that because of the need of solving these common problems, we might learn to work together more generally? Is there any appetite in your countries, and specifically for Bangladesh and India in this case, to do that? I mean, we're sitting in the clear, beautiful skies of Colombo, but back home we've got this major problem. And is that something that could potentially help us learn to cooperate?
I would just respond by saying that at the end, it's a very much regional political economy issue. Whether you would put your political differences ahead, or you would be driven by the economic necessity. I would always say that, look at India and China. They are fighting on many fronts. They have huge political differences. But they are the two largest trading partners. They are they are cooperating in many areas also. And as you said, Dr. Wignaraja mentioned about the largest Chinese FDI destination is India now, and also the kind of trade that these two countries do. So why these other, why we can't then like India and Pakistan or other South Asian countries, they can't really cooperate, ignoring some of the political difference we have. I would say at this moment in South Asia, probably the best bilateral political relation is between Bangladesh and India. This is leading to a lot of projects, bilateral projects between these two countries in terms of connectivity, in terms of infrastructural development, in terms of different trade facilitation. I think that if we can take this lesson and carry it forward for the other South Asian countries, I think there are much, much bigger gains. We can, look at the simple economic gains. Probably at this moment, the economic gains, the size is not huge. But when it comes to peace dividend, when it comes to dynamic gains, I can see that there are much, much larger gains.
My own take here would be that these economic issues are often hostage to political tensions. And I mean, I don't have a very realistic outlook on that. Unless India considers its development priority, it will not shake itself in the South Asian context. That is my own hunch. And so I guess it will take time for economics to move ahead of political association that we are in right now. I don't see a very quick, optimistic outlook to take care of the smog. We will call it that it's probably in Lahore more than in Delhi, or it originated in Lahore, not in Delhi. We'll spend a few weeks on discussing that till like that. So I don't have a very optimistic projection.
I do agree that common problems are a very good basis for reigniting South Asian cooperation, with India really helping its neighbors. We have a very good example in Sri Lanka. So some years ago, India launched a national ambulance service here, which has been incredibly successful, and the ambulances are all over this country. So it's a free service that takes a patient, even in a rural area today, to the nearest hospital. Okay? And Sri Lanka has built upon that by adding to that fleet and so on. It's a nationwide number. So that was a very good example of something that was apolitical, related to health. And you can imagine, women who are in stages of pregnancy having difficulty, people with stroke and things of this type being rescued. So health is one really important area. Another one, I think, which would be very apt, would be natural disasters. So disaster risk management is really a curse of this region. We have floods, we have all sorts of other calamities that may arise. We've had a terrible tsunami in Sri Lanka. And that is an area where, South Asian cooperation could make some headway with some sort of mechanism for emergency support in regard to life. And I think that's a really important area. So we could start with these small things. Environment is a little more contentious, but something we've got to deal with. And then eventually education, such as this exchange. So I think these softer sectors may be more fruitful, and start with like-minded countries, and then you try to add as you go forward. And I think it could be very, very useful. And the more contentious economic issues can come, naturally, as the trust and willingness is built up.
All right, so as we begin to wrap up, I want to then, we've spent about an hour talking about South Asia as a region, but the purpose of the discussion is also just to think about South Asia's future, and for that we can now go to a disaggregated view. And let me sort of just start an exercise of reflecting on what we think the biggest threats and challenges to each of our the biggest sort of opportunities and challenges to our countries are in the next 30 years. And so just to give you guys a minute to frame your responses, I'll go first. To me, the biggest threat that Pakistan faces is that we still do, in fact, have a slow growth in our human development indicators, but we are nowhere near the rate of change of the rest of South Asia. This is to me, as graphic a picture of being left behind as an economist can portray. So if we've gone from having some of the highest life expectancy in the region to some of the lowest, our education figures are abysmal, and that's just quantity. When you move to quality, our universities are in disarray for the most part. There are some bright spots, in particular in the private sector, but also, so not just education, but health and so on. These are things where, so human development is something that we haven't paid enough attention to, and that to me is the biggest threat. The biggest opportunity to my mind is that we've gone from being very apolitical in the 90s and early 2000s to being at a point where, by virtue of the opening up of the media, perhaps, and others can sort of reflect on what they think the causal factors are, and because of we're a very young country and we're moving to become more urbanized, we have a lot of pent-up energy politically that's sort of ready to burst out and potentially reconfigure our political relations in a way that potentially brings more power to the people. And so for me, those are the two big threats and opportunities that we have over the next few years. Kusum.
I think for India, I would say both threat and opportunities to pursue a high level of growth. Unless we are economically on a high growth platform, I would think that growth is a cure for all. We can be more responsible to our neighbors, we can be more efficient within our economy and develop ourselves. And that's the challenge is to go on a high growth path. That's how I think India needs to be more economically stable if India needs to contribute to development across neighbors.
I would say that, just following what Ali and Professor Das has mentioned, that it's very common that though the country is growing at a very higher speed, I think fundamental question is the quality of growth. So in terms of job creation, in terms of inequality, in terms of social sector for development. So these are opportunities. Of course, Bangladesh is passing through the phase of demographic dividend. I think the country has that opportunity to exploit this demographic dividend. But if we can't exploit it properly, it can turn into a demographic disaster. So I think these are the major challenges what I can see in the future. In addition to that, I think SDGs have given us a kind of bigger context. I know there are disputes, there are some of the debates about SDGs. But despite that, some of the targets, some of the milestones which are ahead in terms of in front of the policymakers, I think the policymakers, they can really take them as challenge and opportunities as well. Thank you.
So sure, growth and inequality are big issues, but I think for Sri Lanka, probably one trend that I think will manifest itself as we go into the next 30 years is going to be this phenomenon of growing old before we become rich. What I mean by that is Sri Lanka is on the cusp of becoming an upper middle income economy. That $4,000 odd, which is the World Bank Atlas magical method of becoming an upper middle income country. But whether we become a high income country easily with the demographics is our basic challenge. So we buck the trend in the rest of South Asia. In the rest of South Asia, the dependency ratios favor the youth. And that's one of the big things that we look at India versus China. China is growing old, India is growing young, on balance. Sri Lanka, sadly, is following the East Asian pattern. In fact, our dependency ratio, when you look at that, the percentage of young to the percentage of people getting old, the other way around, is unfavorable. So we have this aging population phenomenon that has caught up with us there. Now, some people see that as a burden, right? We have free health and education. So the health bit of it is going to have more burden from older people. That's one way of looking at it. The other way, which I think is really the challenge for the young in Sri Lanka, is how do we make the silver-haired generation, who typically are richer, how do we make them a consumption class where they are buying a lot of new goods and services? It could be care for the elderly. It could be certain types of goods and services that are demanded for the elderly. And these are all very important as the family system, which cares for elderly people, breaks down, right? And new kinds of health services. So that's one kind of a challenge that I think is terribly important. The other challenge for Sri Lanka, I think, which is really on how we manage our geopolitics. We're situated in this kind of space between China, India, and the US, okay? We have China very present here, and has a lot of our infrastructure in Chinese hands. You come in Colombo, and the most iconic buildings are in Chinese hands. Yeah? We have India that is very clear in its intention. Shiv Shankar Menon, the former National Security Advisor of India, said Sri Lanka is like an aircraft carrier 22 miles off the coast of India. Now, if China's influence increases, this geopolitics is going to be a problem for us. Okay? You have the US, which is conspicuous by its absence, if you like, in this region. And how this plays out will determine the future prosperity of this country and indeed the rest of the region. So I think we need to think a little bit beyond the economics into some of these other structural and geopolitical issues. And I think a serious thought needs to be given to this.
All right. So there are lots of things that we didn't talk about today. We didn't talk about automation and robotics. We didn't talk about mass surveillance that is now happening in pretty much every country because of technology. We haven't talked about, in a big way, we haven't talked about geopolitics in the world and how that sort of engages South Asia going forward. We haven't talked about the increase in disasters that are expected as the world warms up and other ecological disasters that will happen. And there are so many unknown unknowns, to quote Donald Rumsfeld. There are so many things that we don't know about what's going to happen next. But I'd encourage all of you to keep thinking about the future as we go. I'd like to thank Dr. Wignaraja, Dr. Raihan, and Dr. Das for their time, and in particular the University of Colombo, Professor Selim and the rest of the organizers here, and all of the sponsors for this wonderful event. Looking forward to a wonderful 3 days. Thank you.